All right, we're live. Just hit record right now. We're just trying to figure out how we're looking on screen on camera today. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another Pronto Marketing Thought Leadership episode. This is your host, Matteo Trovato. I'm joined today by Pierre, our Senior Marketing Manager at Pronto Marketing. And I'm excited to have on the show the founder of Agency 8200, Steve Zeitchik. Steve, great to have you on the show today.
Thank you very much. Great to be on. Thanks.
Fantastic. In this episode, we are going to take you along for an in-depth conversation about the full retirement of third-party cookies from Google Chrome in September of this year and what that means for inbound marketing. Then we'll try to understand how AI and data can help businesses succeed with their marketing efforts in this new cookieless world. And I would say let's just jump right into our interview. Pierre, you want to take it away for us?
Yeah, thanks for the introduction, Matteo. Hi again, Steve. Hi, everyone. I'm very excited to be talking about kind of the current landscape of inbound marketing, digital marketing as a whole, and how this is all impacting lead generation for service providers, B2B companies out there. And like you started, talking about, Matteo, there was a big announcement last year that, Google is going to be retiring the cookie. Now, it's been extended a couple times. Will it happen? Will it not? But the plan is that it should be extended by the end of 2024. We'll see if it actually happens this time. But everything is showing that, we're going in that direction. And so, cookies are super important for advertising, tracking people's movements online, and then doing lead generation. So kind of, I think, Steve, we were talking about the work you do from branding, social media to appointment setting. And so I think this is a very relevant announcement and kind of interested in getting your take on, how this change in the digital marketing world is going to impact the effectiveness of strategies used for generating leads for inbound, for B2B service providers as a whole.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and thanks both of you for having me on. I appreciate it very much. You're right. I don't know when this is going to happen and how it's going to roll out, but I think to some degree this is inevitable. And I think that if one is proactive about how to deal with this and confront it and embrace it instead of being in denial, then it lends itself to a lot of opportunities. It speaks primarily to what I would call first-party data collection, meaning being in charge of your own community, being aware of building a community, having stronger direct relationships, controlling the data and the analytics. And we'll delve deeper into that probably later on in this conversation. But it's something that I've been very aware of and perhaps a bit paranoid about for a while. I believe firmly that businesses and brands should be controlling the relationship that they have with their own communities, as opposed to leveraging third parties to the extent that they have exposure and they're vulnerable because the data could just be pulled out from under them. So I think right now there's a window where we could, if that transition might not be, it might be a scary one because it's always challenging to get out of a comfort zone. But I think when people do that and embrace it, they're going to realize that the comfort zone that they've had, sometimes when we're comfortable, it doesn't necessarily speak to the fact that it's a healthy relationship. A lot of people have dysfunctional behavior that's comfortable. So I think that this is something that's definitely going to happen. And I think companies need to be proactive in tracking their analytics, driving the traffic, and really embracing community. I think ultimately, if they do it ethically and they do it with transparency, it's going to be healthier for the brand and the relationship they have with their clients in terms of attracting and retaining clients. That's my feeling. Excellent question, by the way. I think it's very timely, and I think it's coming right around the corner.
Yeah, one thing you mentioned is really sort of owning your community. And I think that resonates with a lot of small business owners out there. One of the great things is, for example, with having a website is that you own it. You can build it, take it wherever you want. No one's really going to take it away from you as long as you're, paying for that domain name, address, and all of that. You can do whatever you want with it. That's not always the case with platforms like Google Ads, where the rules can change, and or Facebook, where you may be able to advertise one day but not the next one, or just the data that you have to run this targeted advertising campaign may change. And I think we've seen that happen with different platforms over time, and so a lot of the work and effort is put into it is lost. Do you see people gravitating towards certain platforms? Is it website? Is it certain social media platform? Is it really building a community around their LinkedIn profile, LinkedIn group that they create and own, or is it more even like building their own microsite, or on top of their website, that people are actually creating those communities?
Okay, wow, these questions are right on. I'm really enjoying this. So first of all, I think it's important that whatever the brand decides to use as their primary platform, they should really understand where they're driving traffic to. Now, there is an exception to that, and I'm going to circle back to that in a moment. There is an exception to that, which is sometimes a brand could be targeting diverse audiences, let's say, that require different messages, even if hypothetically the call to action is exactly the same. So there needs to be an awareness, but ultimately you want to aggregate that data, whether it's on a website or a social media platform. I think that could be somewhat dependent on the company and the objectives and what they're trying to accomplish. But there always has to be that sensitivity to the fact that you don't want to put all your eggs in one basket. My personal bias, and I don't like having bias, I'm a big data geek, and so I like data really telling me the narrative as opposed to me forcing the narrative on the data. But that being said, that I have a personal bias towards the website because I just feel the more we control it, the more we own it, the less sensitive we are to random and arbitrary restrictions or things that could just change in the blink of an eye. So you spend all this time, building up yourself on some platform, and then all of a sudden find yourself exposed. So the more you can own it, I think the healthier it is. Conversely, the other way to approach that is to be on all the platforms with the main driving going back to the website. So instead of saying, let's say LinkedIn, which I think is a phenomenal platform when used properly, but then you could take content and repurpose it onto other platforms like YouTube or Instagram or TikTok, whatever is appropriate at the time and whatever is relevant for your audiences. But again, always driving traffic back to that one place where you can aggregate it and then repurpose it in a way that you could re-engage and develop a stronger direct relationship with the end client.
Yeah, for sure. Whenever we're building digital marketing campaigns, whether it's for clients or our own, actually, we're always trying to think, okay, is there a logical way we can bring people back to our site and kind of keep the conversation going there and kind of get them to engage with our brand more in our content and kind of learn more, sort of, in sort of a more organic way. Okay, we get their attention where they are, like you said, on LinkedIn or on YouTube, and then from there, we kind of keep them interested in learning more, but more through our site. And that's where, having all those call to actions that point to that is
kudos. That's right on.
And another thing that, you kind of mentioned about, kind of was sort of big data. And I think this is super relevant because you have a lot of background working in big data and analytics and social media analytics. So I think, cookie is one of the, just to tie it back to that, is one of the big things that sort of made big data explode among many other things. So, you could think maybe big data is dead, but ironically, I kind of see sort of those two major technologies sort of going in different directions at the same time. On the one hand, you've got the cookie, and then you've got the rise of AI. And AI maybe even, a greater sort of factor when it comes to creating big data. And so it's sort of funny to see the two trajectories and maybe even seeing them happening at the same time. It's hard to see. There's no necessarily any direct correlation, but I know you're big on AI and you're using a lot of it. So just kind of curious to see again, hear from you. How do you see brands leveraging this already and kind of developing more targeted and personalized campaigns around that?
Yeah, that's a very interesting insight. I agree with you. Maybe it's not a correlation, but there's certainly some type of dynamic going on and that's happening. I think that's part of, let's say, the evolution of marketing, perhaps the evolution of humanity, if we want to get a little more philosophical about it. But I agree. I think that AI is definitely a tool that can and should be leveraged. And before I delve deeper into that, I'll also say that the tools that are coming out now, and tools are just tools. I mean, the question is, how do you access it and how do you implement them? But the tools that are coming out that are available to people are very powerful, number one. And number two, really equal the playing field, meaning a smaller company these days, a smaller business, let's say, can really amplify their brand and engage much more efficiently from a bandwidth perspective. Let's say from the two main resources that we have that are finite are time and money, right? Whether it's us or our teams, our companies, whatever it might be. And so any tool that enhances both of those and streamlines it without not only not compromising quality, but actually enhancing potentially quality, to me it's a no-brainer. So I think it bridges that gap to some degree. To be more specific, I think that some of the tools that AI, or some of the ways that AI could be integrated into marketing strategies and business development strategies, which go obviously hand in hand, are uncovering insights into customer behavior, whether it's from internal data or external data, but certainly accessible, even to the degree where it can become predictive much earlier than in the old days. I mean, when I say the old days, I mean even a few years ago, where things had to be extracted to spreadsheets and then tracking sentiment, all those things. But now you have tools where AI can extrapolate in a meaningful way and create dynamics where you can predict customer needs in a way that will resonate authentically. Again, as long as you're using it, as long as it's not overstepping, and that's up to the user. So any tool that we have, let's say, let's be simplistic and say a hammer, right? A hammer, could be a great tool in the right hands, or it could be a terrible tool in my hands, right? So it depends on if the person knows how to use the tool and how to use it properly. So I think in terms of potentially, just to give you the scope of it and how broad that spectrum is, it's insights, it's predictive, it's potentially becoming it's becoming easier to create content personalization, generating content. I wouldn't rely on it blindly, but certainly it could be thought-provoking and insightful in terms of uncovering trends. And then the other tool I would say is that with AI, as it relates to your earlier point about the cookies and the traffic and the ability to, or the inability, let's say, to leverage cookies potentially to identify audiences, I think we could use AI to create a greater sense of tying the company's CRM or database of customers with certain automation tools, so that you could create effective strategies and execute them, and let those decisions be data-driven to really maximize engagement and amplification, and ultimately conversion.
Hey, Steve, just maybe to take a quick step back from the AI conversation, big data, and how AI actually can help with personalization. I kind of want to become a little bit more tactical. And before you touched a little bit on building trust, building a community, and really trying to communicate with an audience. How can actually B2B service providers do that? Like, what does it mean for a B2B service provider to engage or to build a community? What does it mean for an IT company to do that, for example?
Yeah, okay, great. So I think that the first thing that people have to, I think there are two dynamics going on in the world that everyone can relate to. And I don't think it has to do with what kind of company one owns, what kind of customer they're engaging. Has nothing to do with socioeconomic, has nothing to do with geography. I think the two things that are front and center these days that didn't exist to the same degree a few years ago even is, number one, there's a lot of noise out there right now. And so there's this tendency to try to cut through the noise by simply screaming louder. I think that's ineffective. I think it could potentially be obnoxious, and it could be something that turns off clients. So that's one dynamic. The other dynamic that's happened over the last few years, and again, this is really, across the board, by age, by gender, by geography, all the different, variables, is that it's very people have a very short attention span. They're used to getting right now all their content in 15-second snippets. So to go back to your question, I think that the way someone engages with the community, before we talk about how to implement strategies and platforms and everything else, it comes down to being committed to two things that I think people appreciate. One is transparency, which I mentioned earlier, but I can mention that 100 times a day, because I think people, I think ethically it's the right thing to do. But in addition to that, I think people appreciate that and pick up on that. And number two, I think people appreciate authenticity. So let's say, while 10 years ago, let's talk about the influencer space, for example. 10 years ago, right, there's been a huge shift there where people always wanted these celebrity influencers to just, talk about their brand in any possible way. While now we recognize the importance of the relevance of the audience and the engagement, and almost to the point where we believe that business owners should become the influencer. They should be the thought leader or the authentic resource. And I think if brands are going to put out content that's meaningful, that speaks to their expertise, I think that their clients will either, or the potential clients, their prospective, let's say their pool base that they're trying to target, will either immediately engage with them, okay, because it resonates, or they will file it away as a credible resource for when they experience a pain point that's being addressed by this authentic opinion leader. And I think that these days, it's much easier to amplify your brand message. So going back to something that Pierre actually mentioned earlier, which is what platforms would I be on? I want to make sure that I'm being clear that just because I think that the website is a place where potentially people should be driven to, that doesn't mean in any way, I'm not minimizing the power and the impactfulness of leveraging third-party platforms to amplify your message. I'm just saying that the allegiance that I encourage business owners to have, that my clients to have, is to their clients, and to not become overly committed to the platform which they're using to engage with their clients. That to me is a variable in the formula of how do I communicate in a meaningful way to my target audiences. So I would say that the way brands want to, just to summarize, the brands want to engage with their audiences by putting out meaningful content and potentially offering relevant, value-driven, I don't want to say giveaways, because I'm not talking about a Starbucks card or something. I'm not knocking Starbucks, okay? But something that's relevant to the people we're talking about, whether it's an infographic or whether it's a report or a white paper or a consultation, but those type of things, or a panel, a webinar, these are kind of things that create meaningful content that could be, amplified, as well as value to the prospect base. And again, just to be clear, I'm not knocking any brand. I'm simply saying that it's much more meaningful to give a Starbucks card to a coffee audience than it is to talk to an IT client who you want to talk about with, let's say, cybersecurity. That was my underlying message.
Yeah, I definitely can relate to what you're saying in terms of, there's a lot of noise, especially when it comes to like shiny new marketing technologies. I mean, I'm the first guilty one when it comes to that. I'm a total MarTech geek, and I've been doing marketing automation for a really long time now. So I'm always excited to learn about a new tool or a new CRM and whatnot. But you're right. I think people need to be thinking about, what does my audience actually care? Do they care about the technology? Do they care about the cybersecurity software? Or do they care to hear from me as a thought leader within their community, within their service area, how this will impact me, who actually is not like an IT security geek or is not an expert in that field. And now what we see a lot of people still do, and it's funny because, we just went through COVID and doing a ton of things remotely. We do see people going back and doing simple things like lunch and learns. And I think that actually ties back with the idea of how do you build a community? And you can build your community online, but there's no one saying you can't build your community in real life too. Now, the tools and the strategies maybe that you use are still going to be digital first to then bring people back into the real life. So, like you were saying, you could do a webinar that could be hosted on a platform that you own, but you'll promote it on your website, you'll promote it on LinkedIn or wherever your client and audience is, and that will still work. So yeah, it's quite interesting to see as well, like how we're sort of almost doing full circles at time.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think it's you're making an excellent point. I think it's just because I think it's wonderful to say that a small brand could be global very easily these days. But that doesn't mean that a small brand has to be global. It doesn't even mean that a large brand has to be global. I think it's nice to have choices. I've learned as I've gotten older to embrace choices. And I think these days there's a whole buffet of, opportunities that someone with creativity and something meaningful to share, can leverage and monetize in a way that creates a win-win dynamic because, it could be lucrative and it could be fulfilling and it could also create real value and should create real value for the end client. So I agree with you. I mean, we're doing campaigns now actually that cross over to that world. I think it's going to be interesting to see how things evolve as the, augmented reality, virtual reality, as we continue to evolve. And I think we should always be looking at cutting edge solutions to be able to help cut through the noise that we mentioned earlier. But you're 100% right. There's nothing that would replace, let's say, a handshake or a hug or whatever the dynamic is. But in order to get that much closer to that relationship, there are a lot of tools out there that could really accelerate it without compromising the integrity of that dynamic. I do want to touch on one more thing, which I think about what I said earlier, just as a reminder that I think that the right ways to offer, that when you're using the right offer to a potential audience to engage with your brand, that's also a method of filtering that the target audience is relevant. Because if let's assume for a minute you're talking about a white paper and it should be super intriguing to your customer base, if someone's not interested in that, that might be speaking to the fact that you're not targeting the right audience. You have to think about, maybe your audience is residing somewhere else. And so you have to think about what that really says. It's not a matter of, let me change what I'm offering to something that will resonate with more people if you know your audience, right? It's also a question of understanding where's the disconnect and not making any underlying assumptions about why there's a disconnect, but really looking at each variable in that formula until you can create something that can grow exponentially.
Yeah, I guess another interesting point is that, especially for B2B companies, but I see this type of trend pretty much everywhere, also across B2C companies, is that most companies tend to follow trends and new channels and new platforms as they come up. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the new channel, the new platform, is surrounded by their target market, right? Or is visited by their target market. And on top of that, small B2B companies tend to have limited marketing budgets. How do you personally think a B2B service company needs to identify the right channel for them to be as sure as possible that the message they put out is, to the very least, seen by their target market, and then iterate on sort of the messaging itself to make sure that whatever they are proposing and offering to that target market really resonates and eventually converts into conversations that could lead into business for them.
Right. Look, I think that's a great time. This is a great time to really, it's a very enjoyable time to sort of answer that question, because the ability to test different messages is not, if you're tracking it carefully, it's all about the data, right? And I know I could geek out about data occasionally, but I think that if you are able to look at the data, then you don't have to spend a lot of money on it. It's the days of what I would call spray and pray as far as marketing is concerned, which is just casting a very wide net and seeing what's caught, is I would say it's not even antiquated; it's obsolete, and it's unacceptable. So I think that there are ways to test the markets very inexpensively and very effectively, possibly even without any cost, right? But if you put out different messages on different platforms and see what's getting engagement, that's very telling. That's number one. Number two, I'm sorry. Okay, sorry, I thought I heard feedback. Number two, I would say the same thing to about a business that I practice in my own personal life, which is it's always easier to learn from other people's other people's mistakes and successes than to make my own mistakes, right? So if you can access, which is it is accessible, if you can access other businesses in your peer group, what's worked for them and what has not worked for them, and leverage that data in a way where you avoid the mistakes they've made and accelerate the successes they've had, it's a much more efficient way to grow. And I don't care if a person's, a solopreneur or a Fortune 100 company, right? That all applies equally to them. There is a massive amount of experience out there, and it's accessible. And so I think that to roll up your sleeves and do some research could save you a lot of not only dollars or whatever currency you're using, but a lot of heartache. And so I would say that there needs to be that effort, but you can't ignore that. I mean, I would put that front and center in terms of researching. And yes, maybe it slows down the process initially, but it'll make the pursuit much more successful and fruitful. And I also think that the metaphor I would think about would be, it's like you're laying down a foundation on which you're going to build, right? So the less cracks you have in your foundation, the more stable your building's going to be. It's much easier to build something on a more solid level if you try to avoid the mistakes you can avoid that are avoidable, right? And I guess mistakes happen, that happens. But to the extent that you could avoid it and learn from others, I think one has an obligation to do so.
100%. Yeah, from personal experience, I would say looking at competitors or having a peer group to rely on is definitely a helpful tool to have. It could also be that by looking at competitors, you end up comparing yourself to a company that, yes, offers the same service, but is not playing at the same sort of league as you are. And you probably end up just getting swayed a little bit by what they're doing, by their tactics, by their messaging. Try to emulate them, and then end up finding that you're actually not targeting the same audiences, although you're offering the same services. But I 100% agree with you that having people that have sort of walked on the path you are currently walking on before you, and sort of can show you what the mistakes they made before you are, I think it's definitely a helpful tool to have for sure.
Yeah, I think, look, you're right on. I would say even further that by understanding who their audiences are, if the takeaway that you have by understanding their audience and their audience behavior is who you are not going to engage with, I would call that a valuable insight as well. In other words, that's not necessarily, and I'm not suggesting that you're saying this. I'm saying sometimes the data that you look at from your peer group or what you perceive to be your peer group could provide you with insights that are very different than what you went in there for. But instead of blindly sort of just filtering it out, only looking at what you think you want to see, if you allow it to, if you immerse yourself in it and allow it to really tell you, okay, look, this shows you who your audience isn't, or maybe this shows you who your audience should be, or maybe there's a lot of different insights that could come out of data, and I like to go in with my eyes wide open and see what I could glean. That knowledge is gold, and it all speaks to the same thing, which is, any business owner doesn't want to be too rigid, right? If you're using let's say a GPS metaphor, right, you pretty much know what you want your destination to be. And I think that, you want a GPS to tell you how to get there and to reroute you if you have an obstacle. But I think the third critical element, which I'm obsessed with, is you also have to know your current location, right? If you're in a tunnel and you're using GPS, then the directions it's going to tell you are going to be misguided. So I think it's very important to have an honest assessment of your current location. And this type of exercise of looking at who you perceive to be your peer group will help you crystallize that thought in a way that's much more meaningful. Now, if you're already an established business, that doesn't discount this exercise. It just makes it that much more meaningful. It's never too late to do that exercise, but it's critically important that exercise is done. That's my strong opinion. I've seen quantifiable differences with people doing just that one exercise alone, because it provides you with a totally different light. And so you head off on the direction either more confidently or with a different approach. But it's very meaningful in terms of not just sort of philosophically, but on a practical level, the output is significantly different when one follows that type of respect for process and data to fuel the process.
Yeah, and I like the GPS analogy because I think it's quite relevant to a lot of the sort of targeted local campaigns that we and you do for our clients. And if you go into the GPS and say, okay, I'm an IT service provider in Pennsylvania, can I serve someone in New York? You put it in the GPS. The GPS will tell you, yeah, here are the directions. But guess what? That's going to be a lot longer and harder to get there than if you're just trying to serve, King of Prussia or Pittsburgh or anywhere else in Pennsylvania. Not that it's necessarily nearby per se. Those distances can be long too, but actually, the ways well you would get there are going to be longer. The way people are going to be looking at you, oh, well, you're an IT company in Philadelphia, and you say you serve New York, but I really want someone who's local, or what, if I have an emergency, is going to be able to come into the office, and you only do remote. Now I get, maybe you're fine with 90% remote, but you want 10% in the office. And I remember, well, like way back when I was working back in Bethesda, one of our requirements was actually had to have our IT service provider to be in the office like 75% of the time. And that was just because back then, over 15 years ago, that's what we were used to. We had the IT person in the office, and that's what we expected. Even though it was a contractor from just a regular MSP like we have today. So
Different days.
not every MSP want to do that, and so yeah. So you really have to know what you want to do and what you don't want to do. For example, we only do WordPress websites, and we purposely don't do Shopify. Shopify is a fantastic tool, but we specialize in WordPress, and we build with WooCommerce if we have to do an e-commerce site, and that just keeps us more focused and more specialized, and eventually we add greater value to those kind of projects than if we did a little bit of everything now and then. Our process would be disjointed and all that kind of stuff.
Right. Look, I think there's never a harm to being, and that's, I think it's even stronger. I think it's always great to be educated in what you're doing. I think I feel that way as a consumer, and I think our clients and our audiences feel the same way. And I certainly think that we need to think that way as an owner, as a brand, and as a business owner. And by the way, I keep using the word brand loosely, but even even a one-person shop, or every company is a brand or should be a brand. That's part of what we talked about at the very beginning of this conversation related to the cookies and things like that. I think one needs to establish themselves as a brand. That doesn't mean pretend to be someone you're not, or to pretend to be a company that you're not. But I think you have to have a certain, you have to recognize the sanctity, let's say, of what you're building and what you have. And I think that when you have that internally, you project it forward, which is so important when you're dealing with what we spoke about earlier, which was authenticity. I think if you really, if you drink the Kool-Aid and then you amplify it that way, I think people really pick up on that.
Yeah, so like you said, it's, again, focus less on the technology, focus more on building something that is more likely to last, and then figure out how you can amplify that. And I think one of the things, Matteo and I have talked a lot about, and we observe, is a lot of small business owners, they're passionate about their business. They get in there and they work day in, day out, and they want to solve their client's problem, but they don't really want to put themselves out there. And I think that's the challenge. They got into business to solve a specific problem, whether it's law, whether it's IT, whether it's insurance, or financial service type businesses. They don't necessarily want to become a talking head, so to speak, right? And but essentially, that's why we're saying, like, your company needs to have a thought leadership program. And so therefore there's sort of this dilemma: who does it? Are you building a brand, or are you building a person? Is the owner and the person, the brand of the entire company? How do you approach that? And what do you usually recommend to your clients?
Yeah, great. That's look, there's a certain awareness or self-awareness that one needs to have. There are a lot of business owners, especially in certain industries, where they're probably very gifted in what they're doing, but let's say they're introverts and they don't have the comfort level or the ability to communicate in a way that reflects their brand accurately or the value that they provide accurately. You can't pretend someone, is who they're not. So I think being self-aware and honest and having people around you who are going to tell you that is critically important. So yes, that's true. That doesn't mean the brand shouldn't be, a thought leader, let's say. And I think there are ways to put things out where you can accommodate that. And that's getting easier, by the way. Interestingly enough, AI is helping with that as well. I think that will become less and less of a challenge over the next, let's say, year or two, even, through virtual experiences and things like that, which are already available, but are getting better and better by the day. Regardless, I think that there are other ways around it, either using someone else as the talking head who's, credible within the organization or within the industry group, whatever it might be, or putting out content using different mediums, right? So, for example, I'll give you a hypothetical. If you have someone, let's say, who doesn't feel comfortable speaking for a half an hour on some topic that they're experts on, well, maybe they can be involved in a podcast where they're interviewing other people about it, or they could be interviewed on a podcast where they're no longer just sort of free ranging. Maybe someone's asking them questions and they're responding to specific points that they feel very confident in. It's a very different way to communicate, but ultimately it accomplishes the same end goal. I think that it speaks to a larger marketing issue, which is if the box doesn't work, don't try to squeeze more things into the box. Figure out a different box in which you're going to, which you're going to utilize. And I think that's why a lot of times we create plans or processes, let's say, for our clients to follow, but we also very much remind them that it has to be fluid without losing our sense of direction, because there are things that pop up all the time that could create perceived obstacles, or perhaps they could also be perceived opportunities, depending on how you view it and how you confront it. And so I think this is a perfect example of that, where, maybe the person who doesn't have the ability to, I'll give you a different example. It could be a language issue where they don't necessarily speak the same language comfortably as their audience, right? So there are ways they could do it. They could put out content in other ways. They could have other people, but I would not dismiss a reasonable pursuit for marketing because of one obstacle. Rather, if it's still a legitimate way to engage audience, I would say, okay, how else do we accomplish that same end goal? And we deal with that daily. I mean, there are so many options, so many opportunities that if one's just aware of it and very committed to the process, I could assure you that the end goal will not have to be compromised at all.
Yeah, I think thought leadership having a thought leadership agenda is actually a really interesting idea. Generally, my belief is that thought leadership requires potentially 4 ingredients, one of which is a leadership agenda. You need to have valuable experience or primary research if you have done, and to have also a point of view. And I think a lot of small business owners don't necessarily have all of these 3. And so maybe thought leadership could really maybe just be turned into action leadership, where they are, sharing content that is not necessarily original, but is actionable for their target audience. And that would potentially be a little bit less intimidating to a technical business owner who is deeply ingrained in running their businesses, and they know exactly what it means to run a business and what it means to sell and offer the service they're selling or products they're selling. I think that would potentially be less intimidating and potentially a good way for them to step into the brand building exercise that we've been talking about.
Yeah, I 100%. And I can tell you my experience speaks to that on a very massive way. I mean, we deal with that all the time. It's not an uncommon thing, and no one should ever feel that they're the only ones with that or insecure about it. Everybody has their own strengths. And I think that people need to play to their strengths. And it's a matter of how you package it and how you leverage it. But I think that typically, I'll tell you the good news about this is that typically the people who are less comfortable with that, they're also very respectful of process and discipline. I see a lot of times those 2 personalities go hand in hand. And so they understand that there needs to be discipline, there needs to be a process. And so they just understand they might have to figure out what that is. And that's, we help with, obviously, and I'm, not to talk about me, right? But I would say one of the things that companies like mine do is we help with the strategy and how to present it and package it, because that's a very meaningful thing. I will say one more thing in that regard, which is I think consumers right now have been hit up for the last many years, primarily because of social media, with a lot of sizzle and less steak, right? And so when a person has a lot of steak and perhaps lacks a little bit of that sizzle, I think that these days people find that refreshing. They appreciate that. It speaks to the realness of the dynamic. And so, and I don't know if it's done on a conscious level or not, but I do think it resonates with audiences in a very real way. So I'm not trying to put a square peg in a round hole, but I would also say that should be a level of strength and support to the people who feel maybe I won't, engage with people. I actually think audiences are looking to embrace that now, because they're just fed up with all the sizzle and the lack of stake. And you see that in a lot of parts of people's lives these days. You see that in the media, you see that in the, in the political sphere, you see that in a lot. Without, I'm not being, being bipartisan now. I'm just suggesting that it's in a lot of different touch points, and it's being thrown at us in a very obnoxious way 24/7. So I think, someone who's real and they're maybe not as polished, let's say, as someone else in certain things, I think it's refreshing. I think it speaks to a real character. And you don't have to look far to understand how people could be just fed up with that whole, superficial, filtered messaging that's being thrown out there all the time. So I think it's a good opportunity and a good time. This is the right time for real people.
Awesome. Yeah. Pierre, do you have any outstanding questions you want to ask Steve?
No, I think we covered a lot of ground, a lot of really interesting points there, and I think we talked a lot about what we do and what we don't do, and when you were talking about becoming a thought leader, I do think kind of going through that sort of exercise of what we do and what we don't do is super helpful. It ties back with the helping you do hyper targeted campaigns, and I think that's a good way to kind of sort of wrap all of this together, actually. Start with figure out what you do and don't do that will help you put together your thought leadership program, help you understand the people you want to reach, the people you don't want to reach, and obviously knowing what you don't want to talk about will keep you focused, make your content more interesting. So yeah, I think a lot of that resonated with me. And when you talk about sort of putting that thought leadership program and then finding ways to amplify it, and it's easier, if you've done the hard work of figuring out who to target, what to say, what not to say, it tends to pay off. And we see that in our campaigns as well, whether it's for Pronto or for our clients when, we're doing, hyper industry or hyper location focused campaigns. Ideally, you do both at the same time.
Yeah, right. I mean, these days you really can, because you could even be, you could do hyper personalized campaigns on a massive scale, even if you're a small brand or not. But you have that choice. It's just by, the same type of tools where you could tailor messages very efficiently and just, and optimize that segmentation of the audience in a very real, meaningful way, not just from a marketing perspective, but from actually a value add perspective. It's incredibly powerful tools that could provide real value when used in the right way. So, I mean, it's just great. We could talk about this for hours. I mean, I just think it's great when it's very fulfilling when you see yourself making a difference and moving the needle. I think that's for a business owner, I can't imagine many things that makes a person feel that fulfilled when they do something that they're passionate about, and then they see it actually making a difference and it's quantifiable. That's a real thrill. And then you do it over and over again. At the same time, you're building value and you're making money and you're, providing opportunities for your employees and your team. It doesn't get much sweeter than that. Certainly not in our professional life. That's for sure.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, Steve, thank you so much for coming on the show today. Do you have any final thoughts or advice you want to share with our audience?
Yeah. So a couple thanks for that opportunity. I just wanted to say, number one, I would say the takeaways would be, don't feel pressure. I don't care how large a business is, and I don't care how small a business is. Don't feel pressure don't equate having success in marketing with spending tons of money. Creativity and leveraging tools and being disciplined, I think goes a very, very, very long way. So that's number one. Number two is that, if there's anything we could do for people, then we're always happy to speak to people. We could provide free guidance, free consultations, no problem. And then in addition to that, we're also going to be setting up a website. On our website, we'll have a special page for people who have heard about this through Pronto. It'll be agency8200.com/Pronto, where we will present a very, very strong offer of lead generation for clients of all sizes. And so you're definitely welcome to check that out. So again, that's agency8200.com/Pronto. And if there's anything we could do, we're always happy to help out. I very much appreciate this time, and I thank you. I thank the audience, and that's about it for me.
Thank you, Steve. Before we wrap up, I'd like to extend my gratitude to Pierre also. Thank you for the excellent questions, contributions to today's conversation. And with that, stay tuned for more episodes in the future. Until next time, goodbye, everyone.
Thanks, guys. Have a great day. Thank you, guys. Bye, everyone.